looked like. That's the thing as well. So when you're actually looking at clothing in that, we have artists' depictions such as Edward Walsh. Everyone knows the watercolors by Mrs. Simcoe. And essentially, when you're leading into this, you also have the pop culture and its impacts on Regency clothing as well. So here we're going to kind of do a quick little run through of some of the more notable adaptations of Jane Austen, as well as some other notable figures in the Regency era. So when you think about movies in the Regency era, first things you can think of is the BBC Pride and Prejudice series coming out in 1995. Sense and Sensibility again in 1995. And then kind of the other movies that came out around that same era, which was Persuasion and Emma in 96, and then Mansfield Park in 99. You move into 2000, you have the Keira Knightley Pride and Prejudice, Beau Brummel, This Charming Man, done in 2006. Becoming Jane, the Anne Hathaway adaptation of The Young Life of Jane Austen. Kind of moving through, you shout out to Northanger Abbey of 2007, and then Austenland is kind of a change in kind of how people perceive the Regency fashion. Jennifer Coolidge is in this one, so that kind of gives you an idea of where costuming was residing for it. Moving into War and Peace of 2016, and you have the miniseries and that dramatization of Regency fashion in Russia and the invasion of Napoleon. Again, that's it for the year of 1812. Some good, some bad portions of the costuming in that one. Now, when you're completely going into the realm of complete fantasy, you have Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies coming out in 2016. And essentially you have the introduction of essentially petticoats, zombies, and blood. It's kind of a good way to describe that one. Oops, wrong button. And then Emma for 2002, sorry, 2020, where the emphasis was put on the main characters. The female leads are stunningly dressed, where you can kind of look at the imagery that Alexander Brown, the costume designer, did, and you can see the original in the museum that she copied. My only downfall for that one is when you look at the aspects of the men's costuming and the men's clothing, I'm pretty sure the men's banyan is the only thing that's actually accurate in there. If you watch closely, you can actually see a lot of fly front zippers and a few other sins happening. And then moving into the other TV drama that kind of swept Netflix off of its feet, and that is Bridgerton from 2020 and 2021. Here you can see the court scene. This is the Featheringtons being presented in the English court, which is the scene essentially preempting the coming out, coming into court, I should say, of Daphne Bridgerton. Now, I do say this is in the English court for the year of 1813. Unfortunately, for the costume designers for this one, they're French. They're wearing French court dress. It would have been much more English if they walked down the aisle wearing English court dresses from that period. Anyway, at this point, I'm going to switch things to North America. So we've seen what kind of pop culture has done. Now let's see what we actually have for the artistic interpretations in North America. So after the fall of New France in the 1760s and the rise of British rule, you have a lot of artistic interpretations of the events following the English conquest, essentially. So here you have Quebec City in ruins in the 1760s. And then there's kind of a drop-off. There isn't a lot of Canadian art or depictions of Canadian people or clothing until you have the arrival of the Simcoes in the 1790s. So here you can see one of the watercolors from Mrs. Simcoe as she's leaving Niagara in 1794. The only sad thing is, in her watercolors, they're so essentially pastoral, looking at the landscapes and the views of the landscapes, she forgets to draw people. There's a few where you can see kind of an image where there might be a person or cluster of people in the bottom corner, but there isn't a lot of detail for clothing. When she arrives actually in 1792 in Quebec City, she does have this little sketch here she's drawn in, which is a representation of a Canadian officer, an officer's carriage sleigh, as well as a Canadian sleigh as well. So you kind of get a little bit of glimpse into the 1790s in the clothing, but not a lot. Moving up to Edward Walsh, the surgeon for the 49th. This one here is a little excerpt out of his view of Detroit from the Straits taken from the Huron Church, which is from June of 1804. And you get little details of clothing showing. Believe it or not, there actually are more artistic interpretations of indigenous clothing than there is of Western clothing from this era. And then moving out after the war, so moving into the 1820s and the 1830s, when you have a larger emergence of essentially an immigrant culture into Canada, you have a lot more artistic interpretations. The only downside to this is they're focusing in on the major communities and the major ports of call. So that's Quebec City, Kingston, Montreal, York, a little bit from the Niagara and the Queenston area, as well as Detroit. Leaves a lot of Upper Canada, a lot of Lower Canada in a kind of a state of what were they doing? What were they wearing? So again, you have to kind of apply the same cultural characteristics as England. So the class and the influence. So looking at wealth and power, and you're looking at the emergence of essentially the military and or the social elites driving the social culture into Canada. But we know the first circulating library in Niagara was because of the officers funding it. So that class and that social atmosphere drives the emergence of essentially the power in the clothing, as well as what was available in North America. But then you have the rest of that 99% of other people in Canada falling into the category of work and labor. What were they doing? We have lots of artistic interpretations from the wealth and power. This one here is a Isaac Cruikshank caricature. And if you were to actually go into the British Museum and search for Isaac Cruikshank, you could come up with 1,160 references to him alone. A huge amount of work. This one here actually dates from 1791. Whereas when you go into looking at the working class and the laboring people in Canada or in British, any of the British colonies or in England or across the world, it's a lot smaller. This one here is a caricature done by George Walker in 1814 and is out of his series, The Costume of Yorkshire. Here you can see a berry picker here. So let's take a look at kind of winter in Canada or the reality in Canada. Kind of the last couple of weeks have kind of driven it home that Canada is a slightly different atmosphere or essentially everything compared to England or France. So would you expect to see a lady walking across Fort George or into the communities from 1799 wearing the height of fashion from a costume Parisian, from 1807, from 1809, although she does match the buildings nicely, from 1814, from 1815 or 1819, ending off the decade? Are these the reality of what people were wearing in Canada? No, these are the height of fashion. These are the people that are living in London. These are the people living in Paris. These are the people who are controlling essentially the economy and the market. But then when you're actually looking at it, the merchants actually are who are controlling what people are wearing. So let's look a little bit at the essentially the changing demographics from the late 18th century until the mid 19th century. So the late 18th century, you're looking at an average household of around 6 people, with each person consuming around 4 or 7.5 yards per person, or per household, about 42 yards of fabric. Now that comes out to about 16 and a half yards going to the father, 13 for the mother, and 3 per child. A father each year, so annually receiving 1 to 2 new work shirts, a pair of work trousers or breeches, pair of drawers, plus a coat and waistcoat every 2 years. The mother having a new short gown, an apron, and a shift, and then for every 2 years, a new petticoat. And then children's clothing essentially coming from hand-me-downs, coming from their older siblings or from their parents. By the mid-1820s, so after the War of 1812, there's roughly 470 shops or merchants in the province of Upper Canada alone, and each shop supporting roughly 348 patrons to each shop. Now, this number is based just on solely on the population density, and most likely these shops had a much smaller group of people working at, essentially patroning to them. Now, moving up into the 1850s, for the Thomas Darling store in 1858, where his ledger actually has 8 pages dedicated to textiles alone. which came up to roughly 2,300 yards sold in that year, with 30 distinct types of fabrics, shoes taking up a few lines, sewing notions are appearing in the housewares, as well as ready-made clothing. So there's a complete change in how essentially clothing and textiles is perceived or available in the province. So import goods versus domestic goods. So import goods, we're going to take a look here at the Young Mills store, which is located in Leeds County for the year of 1808. And this store will be highlighted a couple other times. When you're actually looking at it, for that year alone, there was actually $869 worth of sales solely dedicated to fabric and cloth and textiles, of which 46% were dedicated to cotton, 38% dedicated to woolen fabrics, and then other fabrics taking up 17% of the sales. I know this kind of is an interesting fact that the lowest one would be linens and or luxury fabrics. However, everyone says linen, 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 everything has to be linen for shirts, for chemise, for undergarments. Then why is the number or the percentage so low? Well, actually, that'll be explained in a few seconds when I get over to the domestic goods. That store in that year alone had 61 buyers of fabric or notations, 42 buyers of ready-made clothing to the equivalent value of $101. Now let's look at Niagara and the Servos Mill accounts, the ledgers from their accounts, running from 1784 until 1816. A little bit of information about the Servos Mill before we get started on their textile atlas is in 1787, they are the highest producer or the top producer of wheat milled in the Niagara region. So that kind of sets the precedence of how well the store is doing. In 1791, they actually opened a second mill because the first mill was actually damaged, but they have the financial stability to be able to do that. Now, when it comes down to what they're producing for textiles, they're producing bags, shirts, inclusive weaving of cloth, as well as sewing services on the side as well. They also branch out into shoemaking and other domestic goods. In 1784, the making of a fine linen shirt cost 10 shillings. A calico shirt, so a cotton shirt, cost 4 shillings. In 1806, the carding of wool would have cost 80 shillings per hundredweight. And in 1808, the weaving of linen cost 1 shilling per yard, which is a nice relation back to the Young Mills store for the same year of 1808 and why other fibers, aka linens and that, were so low. If you have a domestic source for linen weaving costing 1 shilling per yard, you're going to go with the domestic source. This also brings in the whole concept of homespun or home production of yarns and textiles, which you do see as a dominating factor across most households. Now, there are some accounts saying, well, why would the women or could the women working these looms and these have the ability at the time in amongst their other duties in their daily life to be able to weave fabric and then to sew the garments themselves? Well, there's a whole, that's its own topic on its own when you're looking at women's domestic economy. But you can see a lot of women are actually doing this as a means to supplement their own income or to supplement their family's income. And they're doing this specifically for that. Now, continuing on, we're going to look at men's shoes that they're selling. And then for the year of 1787, a pair of men's shoes cost 4 shillings. Now, this kind of relates into our modern life and our modern economy of what's going on, and that's inflation. Most of us are probably seeing inflation over our lifetimes or in the last 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Well, between 1787 and 1797, a pair of shoes went up to 10 shillings. And then by 1806, they went to 14 shillings. So you're seeing that increase in the cost of what the material is in. That's either saying the quality is going up or the quality, unfortunately, is either going down and they're making more and it's essentially a consumer economy at that point. Looking at the variety of goods or import goods as well as ready-made clothing. So let's look at the textiles that were available as well as the notions in the ready-made clothing. So this is again from the year of 1808, and we're looking at cotton textiles coming in with calico, muslin, ticking, check, jean, fustian, and corduroy. And you also see the odd reference from other stores and not in this sampling, including nankeen showing up as well. Linen fabrics such as cambric, sheeting, and Osnaburg, which is a blend actually. Woolen fiber or woolen textiles of cloth, flannel, baize, coating, Durant and Russell. And then that luxury fiber textiles such as velvet, netting, silk, imitation, and bosbane. And then when you're looking at notations that are being sold, so those are the people who are actually buying stuff to make clothing. You're seeing the basic things you think: needles, threads, ribbons, ties, thimbles, things you need to sew. What's interesting is there actually are ready-made patterns being sold. So there's actually ready-made patterns for waistcoats, for frocks, for gowns, aprons, and caps. Unfortunately, what those look like, what their patterns were, I do not know. The source that these came from does not know either. They're essentially just listed as waistcoat pattern and then the price sold for it. And then for ready-made clothing and garments, handkerchiefs taking up the top tier, the most items sold. Hats, gloves, socks, shawls, mittens, stockings, waistcoats, shoes, and then a wrapper. I would love to know what the wrapper was, if they're referring to a woman's either a bedgown or a long dressing gown, or a man's wrapping gown or banyan. Unfortunately, we probably will not know what that garment was referring to. But that kind of gives you an idea of what textiles, what notations, as well as some of the ready-made garments were in Upper Canada in 1808. So when you look at this, can we apply this to what they could be made into? This little engraving here is actually from William Payne's, from his series of rustic figures from 1813. William Payne's was actually notorious for recycling his older images, which is probably why you're seeing that dropped waistline on the one woman on the left. However, you do see the fish scene almost repeated again by another artist in the 1820s. So they're kind of using and readapting and applying these images throughout this entire century, essentially the decade, I should say. Wrong button. So let's take a look at some of the clothing for women. And this talk is going to mostly focus it on women. I will have a few highlights of men's clothing, but what we're going to do is kind of highlight some of the garments that were available. But before we do that, can you see my mouse at all by chance? Yes. So this man right over here is one of the only men I'm actually going to highlight. And the neat factor about him is he's wearing a smock, and he's actually got his breeches at the knees undone. So just down here, you can see how his knees are undone. You see a lot of laboring and or working class men undoing their breeches. Ease of motion and movement because of the tight fitted nature of the garment. So that's kind of a neat little thing that you're seeing that in some of these paintings as we go. But now looking at the women in this painting, the one that just got circled in the just off to the center there, very typical, wearing either a bedgown or a short gown, a pair of petticoat, a blue shawl, a black silk bonnet or cap, as well as a head covering. Very typical. The woman just in front, you can actually see she's wearing a pair of black fingerless gloves to protect her arms. Again, either from the sun or also from the dust from essentially sifting the wheat there. The next lady that's circled is actually wearing a red gown with a blue apron in front. You can see just a tiny little bit of white, most likely either a handkerchief around her neck. Again, that very typical black silk bonnet. And again, working just as hard as everyone else in the scene. Lady just in front of her there, you can see those fingerless gloves again, most likely being made out of linen. A white short gown, most likely, with a green petticoat and apron, and either a silk-covered straw bonnet or a straw bonnet with ribbons affixed to it. A very typical scene for country life. During the 18th century, into the 19th century, up until essentially the mechanization, the harvest was the most important time of the year. I probably don't have to say that, but that's when everyone came together for a common goal. No matter if you were a child, if you were a woman, or if you were a man, your job was to get that harvest and get those crops off the field. So let's come out of this kind of that domestic aspect and switch into women and the army, and women who can either be seen in the camp of an army or those that could be employed by the army. So this is going to be more of a timeline view instead of a single depiction. So I've actually taken clips out of individual prints and then applied them to this scene, and I'll talk about them as they come in. So we're going to actually start this conversation off in 1803 with some more William Payne's depictions. And that one is actually a series of military scenes or depictions out of a large series of prints that he did. This one is actually his plate number 4 and is depicting camp cooks. Again, you're seeing the use of short gowns and petticoats, white caps, shawls around the neck, and very much working. The next one, which just appeared at the very back there, I don't know if you've seen it come in, it's just hiding right back here, is actually a female barber, and she's actually wearing a regimental coatee, a blue petticoat and a cap, as well as a black neckerchief. So if you're in camp, or if anyone says a woman shouldn't wear a man's coat, well, there's a good example of a woman in camp wearing a man's regimental. Now, I don't know if that coat is a current issue coat, or if it's one that has essentially been demilitarized, either been stripped of its buttons and its lace. But there's still an example there. And there's a few others throughout the decade where you see women wearing regimental coats in camp. So let's now move up to 1808 and a John Atkinson print. This one is actually a depiction of a sutler's tent. So a sutler was someone who followed the army and sold food. So here you see 2 women actually engaged at this table. One seated on the bench beside the one in private there, wearing a floral print gown, a white neckerchief and a pair of small shoes, and a what appears to be a straw bonnet. And the other woman standing up beside the other private, her arms looped around him, wearing what appears to be a yellowish colored gown, a white apron, a red shawl, and that typical black silk bonnet, as well as an interesting looking robe type garment with a train on it. The English were very notorious for hanging on to those older customs of the trains, and you do see them still showing up in gowns as late as 1810, 1815 for wealthier events. But then that doesn't say that this woman doesn't have an older garment that's being adapted. Now let's look in 1811 and the arrival here in camp from this Woodward print. And you can see that same typical image, women on the campaign, women marching with the army, the wives of the enlisted men. The one wearing the red gown is actually without stockings, believe it or not, and just a pair of small black shoes. What appears to be a market bag slung over her shoulder, carrying her children in it, and then a straw bonnet. The lady behind her is most likely wearing what would be referred to as a bib front dress, because the officer that's riding her, now I will say this, they're trying to cross a creek in the original image, so he probably doesn't want to get his boots wet. So he's actually riding her across the creek, and her pins have came undone on her dress, exposing her breasts. However, that does give a nice depiction of what a type of garment could be worn by an enlisted man's wife. A blue silk bonnet, and her stockings have slid below her kneecaps. And again, she's wearing just a pair of small black shoes. Let's move over into the other corner there with a Tompkins print that was done in 1812. Now, I know this one is fairly small and kind of matches into the background, but on a closer inspection of this image, she's wearing a flower or floral print gown that's been pinned up to expose a checked petticoat. Tied from her waist is actually a pin ball, so a cotton ball that's meant to carry pins and sewing needles, as well as a small piece of cloth or a fichu in her hair with a straw bonnet covering her head, as well as a chemise or a handkerchief around her neck. A pair of black small shoes as well. Now, the lady that's walked into camp here is actually a merchant selling vegetables to the army. This one is actually out of an 1814 Dutch print, again, in a military context. She's actually wearing what could most likely be referred to as a bedgown, made out of a roller print cotton, and a very large, either chintz cotton petticoat with a large print in there in an orange color. Most likely a blue wool apron that's actually got a set of ties coming around her back so that it doesn't come and obstruct her view in front. You can see a small little bit of a chemisette being worn under the bedgown, white cap, and then a pair of small shoes. The lady that just appeared there is another merchant out of that same series of 1814 Dutch prints. She's wearing a short gown made of a printed cotton, a striped petticoat, a pair of wooden clogs, a red printed neckerchief, and a large brimmed cap, again, to keep the sun off of her. Now, she's actually a fishmonger, and her apron that she's wearing actually has a built-in bodice as well as the pockets on it as well. Pockets you see normally showing up on women who are selling. Easy place to store cash or change instead of having to fish inside your petticoats for your internal pockets. The lady that just appeared there carrying the balance is actually out of an 1815 occupation of Paris print. And she's actually selling berries to a British private in the original scene. Again, you see that very high empire waist being perpetuated across most of the era. Neckerchief covering most of her chest, and set of necklace inside of there. You can just see the strain of beads as well as a cross below it. An apron tied around the waist with a single pocket. A purple short gown and a blue petticoat. Stockings and a pair of small shoes. Her hair, you can see kind of a little bit of the curls coming out beside them, as well as wrapped up into probably a silk handkerchief around her hair. That same 1815 set, there's another woman here wearing a red and white polka dot spencer with a blue petticoat, most likely out of wool, blue stockings and a pair of black shoes, scarf around her neck, very loosely thrown around, and then one around her head, keeping essentially her hair covered. The last lady and child that walked into the camp here is actually the wife of a Scottish sergeant from a Charles Bance print, again from 1815. And she's actually wearing a two-piece gown made out of a checked cotton or a checked linen, a red pinked-edged shawl around her chest, most likely a black silk cape around her shoulders with arm slits cut in, pair of slippers, and actually a pair of almost buckle shoe type shoes that she's wearing, a straw poke bonnet, and then her child is actually wearing a long sleeve gown as well, and then the red shawl and straw cap. A neat characteristic about the lady, though, her sleeves, you can actually see they're cut on the bias. That's why they're so tight, and it can allow you to actually get your arm inside the sleeve. So now we've looked at the women in this setting. Now, there's also a branch of the army that were actually washerwomen, and the women that were actually washing the clothes for the army. So here we have a depiction actually from the 1860s as the backdrop, actually looking at Fort Mississauga. However, very much the scene that could be taking place down below Fort George. And again, we're going to take a timeline approach to what washerwomen would have looked like. So here we have two women, again from that 1803 William Payne series, washing women on a table, or washing clothing on a table. Again, short gowns, petticoats, and white caps. 1805, another set of the William Payne's prints. This one's actually out of English costume. And there you can see the perpetuation of either the bedgown or a short gown made out of a blue striped linen or cotton, a red and mustard type colored petticoat, again, a pair of clogs, almost like a jockey type cap, short brim and short crown, and then a red handkerchief around her head. This fine young lady is actually from a Scottish washing scene from 1808. Again, that short gown, a colored printed handkerchief around her neck, a blue petticoat, and you can see a little bit of her white petticoats below showing. Now we're going to spend a little bit of time on the next few ladies here, and they're actually out of an Isaac Cruikshank caricature from 1808. And there you see a variety of different garments being worn. Yes, you are seeing the short gowns being worn, but you're also seeing full-length gowns in a working environment as well. The lady in blue, the lady in the center of that group, wearing that blue gown, the cap with the red ribbon. The other lady is wearing the short gowns and the petticoats. And then the one down in the water there is wearing just a blue short gown and a yellow petticoat. Now, a nice aspect of this scene is the lady that just appeared is actually doing her laundry in her stays, better off her transition stays. Yes, she is in public and she is in her undergarments, but that's actually a layover of the 18th century. You see working class women working in the harvest, working in the fields, doing laundry in their petticoats and their stays. That means to stay cool in the hot weather. It's not something that's frowned upon to be seen in your undergarments really until the 1830s and the 1840s, when you're seeing images from the Crimea where they're still wearing, but they finally are covering up those days. So there's a nice image of essentially a corset being worn in a working class setting. Again, with a red petticoat or a jupon rouge. The next lady that appeared in the center there is actually from a 1809 caricature. And she's a little bit more stereotypic, if you will, and more dramatized for a washerwoman. But her short gown is made out of a yellow and green checked fabric or cloth, a blue petticoat, and a nice little addition to this one is that pair of tiny little tied black slippers down in front of the wash basin. So nice to see the shoes being depicted, being worn to the place of work. The next two ladies that join the crowd here are from 1810, and both of them are wearing a gown, so a full garment made of a checked fabric, white underpinnings, a white shawl, and then their caps. And then the last two ladies that are joining the washing party here are from 1814, from the George Walker series of the Costume of Yorkshire. And the one lady in front is wearing a blue and red bedgown or short gown, depending upon how the cut of the body is, as well as a blue petticoat and a small fitted cap. The lady in front of her is wearing a blue and white striped short gown, a purple neckerchief. Her apron's been pinned up again to free the ease and motion of her legs and probably keep it out of the water at that point, as well as another red petticoat. Now, I've said clogs a few times throughout this description of some of these images, and I have a nice reference from the year of 1811, from November the 19th, from Isaac Wilson, who just arrived in the small town of Buddy, York. He's actually writing his parents in England and essentially complaining about the cost of some of the clothing, as well as wishful thinkings of items he brought. Shoes are from $2 to 20 shillings, but they are very little worth. If any of you come over here, bring a good supply with you, or 2 or 3 pairs of new clogs. I regret the want of them most of anything. The roads are very dirty. Such a great reference to muddy York and the fact that clogs are being worn by men as well, not just women. And it's a contemporary account to York. So if you're in camp and you're wanting to not wear shoes or anything like that, just throw a pair of clogs on. More than acceptable. So let's now take a slightly different approach and let's look at the actual clothing that could be represented in these paintings. So let's start off with the undergarments and the small clothes, where you can see the shift peeking out in some of those ladies' images. A square cut garment that hasn't really changed throughout the entire 18th century and right into the 19th century. The only thing you see is the widening of the chest to allow for the opening of the gowns. The wider the chest, the wider the drawstrings on the front of it. Again, square cut and made out of linen. This one here is actually an example that's in a private collection held by the 95th Rifles, a reenactment group in England, and this is off of their website. Now, a pair of transition stays. These ones dating to about 1799 to 1800, and these ones are held by the Victoria and Albert Museum. Again, you can see the transition from the long conical bodies or pair of bodies from the 18th century, and that rising of the waistline for the empire waist, the higher the waistline. The next 2 garments here out of the University of Vermont's collection, or at least off of their website. And again, you're starting off in that 1800 to 1805 era with that first one with an elasticated side of the body. Now, elastic, yes, I did use the term elastic, and yes, I am referring to the early 19th century. Elastic referring to fabric that returns to its shape. So the property is not so much the addition of gum or rubber. There, the elastic is actually a set of metal springs that are set into casings that allow the garment to go out and come back in. And then by the end of the century, or by the 1820s, you're into those long stays and to movement into the progression of corsetry that we know from mid-19th century. Oh, look, we're joined by our washerwoman from 1808 wearing those transition stays. Continuing on our topic here on undergarments and small clothes, we'll look at petticoats. Petticoats to the era can come in a variety of different cuts and shapes. The first one here is actually an example from 1810. And this is from the Carlton House Museum, held by the National Trust in England. Again, you can see it has sleeves attached to it as well as a bodice, and then a very short length for the petticoat. You can see that just kind of filling in as a modesty item. The next one we're looking at here is actually an American example. This one's actually out of the summer collection. She was actually lived in Boston between 1784 and 1826. And here you can actually, it's made out of cotton and is actually embroidered on the hem. Again, sleeveless, so just enough to cover the modesty underneath the dress and then to allow the fullness of the sleeves to show. Our next petticoat here is actually a strapped petticoat, or one that just has strapped linen straps coming up over the shoulder with no bodice attached to it. This one here is held by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in Boston. Not Boston, Metropolitan Museum of Art is, I'm not going to say it because I'm going to screw it up. Anyway, it's a linen example, again, with the flounces, and it's meant to be seen. The unfortunate reality of undergarments is working class clothing is consumed. So the examples we have are coming from that upper middle class to upper class examples. There are, however, a few minor examples of working class garments. This one here is a red petticoat, actually held in the Kunstmuseum in the Netherlands, and is actually made of a linen lining over a wool textile. Again, this one here is a jupon rouge. Everyone loves a nice dance now and then. And we're joined by our washerwoman again, showing off that red petticoat and the short gown combination. So I've said the word bedgown a few times. Let's look at the outer garments a little more. So the bedgown itself has its origin in a 18th century, essentially a relaxed garment, just kind of to wear in the morning, to wear in your house, or for small menial work where you don't feel the necessary need to put on a larger garment. Very loose fitted around the body, and also cut out of one piece of textile. Very similar to what a man's wrapping gown is from the Regency era. There's a nice artisan depiction from the 1770s of a bedgown being worn as just a everyday garment, a working class garment. Now the bedgown by 1800 or by 1820 has slightly changed and adapted to that empire waist. Here you can see it's still that triangular shape cut of that the bat wing shape in the wings, the one piece of fabric. However, that waistline has been brought up right under the armpit and is a lot more fitted, and there's more fullness in the skirts. This example here is actually out of another Dutch museum, and is made out of a printed cotton. This one's also lined in the checked linen, again dating to the first quarter of the 19th century. Wrong button. There we go. And again, we're joined by that lady from 1814, the merchant coming into camp, wearing what appears to be almost the same style of garment with that deep V cut in the back, similar to the original garment that we're looking at. Now the short gown is almost the same as a bedgown, except it's actually a seam at the waist. So a short gown, here's a one from a Dutch collection from the Amsterdam Museum. Again, cut with the drawstring under the breast, drawstring at the neckline, 3/4 length sleeves, and a variety of lengths in the little peplum or the little skirt on it. They can be really short or they can be really long. This example here is again out of a checked cotton. The next we're going to look at here is an English example of a block printed cotton, circa 1810. This one actually came for sale in the Megs Andrews auction. But the nice thing about that one is it shows you the inside, essentially the fastenings for the inside. A plain linen insert that comes across and essentially pins underneath the stays. And then the front drawstring is across and it fits in. And then a nice back image for one there. And we're joined by our washerwoman wearing one. Now, gown style, so full-length essentially dresses. Now, the terminology gown and dress during the Regency period mean two different things. A gown is referring to the actual garment itself. A gown could be short, could be long, could be ornate. A dress was more referred to either a morning dress, riding dress, or riding habit. Archery or sporting dress was referring to that, or fancy dress, so costume balls. Whereas a gown was essentially the term used for the garment itself. So as a working class woman, yes, this one's slightly more elevated. This one's an American example from the Kent State Museum of a bib front dress. So if you remember that 1811 family that walked into the scene there and her breasts were exposed, most likely she was wearing a garment like this and the pins came undone. So what this does is the pin comes down. Again, there's a lap underneath that's pinned closed. And then it's easily accessible to get in and out of, either for maternity or just if you don't have the access to a servant. The next style of gown for a working class woman is the basic drawstring neck. The one dress behind me on that side is the same style. It's a drawstring around the neck, drawstring around the waist, and ties at the front. You can get in and out of the garment yourself. You do see the variety of sleeve lengths. Here's a full length. You see 3/4, and you also see the small cap sleeve as well. This one's also a Dutch example out of printed cotton, again, circa 1810. Now, the next one we're going to look at is a two-piece gown. This again is out of a Dutch collection, where it has a very reminiscent of an 18th century fitted bodice, again with that petticoat that goes underneath. This one's actually out of a printed linen. There's also another style of a two-piece gown, which is actually a matching short gown and petticoat out of the same textile. Very similar to this, except a bedgown kind. Our Lady from 1815, the wife of that Scottish soldier, is wearing almost the exact same front. You can actually see the little scoop here on her gown. You can see where my mouse is. You can see the same scoop that's represented here. So there's a nice depiction of an English woman, or a Scottish woman, I should say, wearing a garment like this in a military context. Again, coming down to that bias cut fitted sleeve. And again, keeping those petticoats short up just above the below the calf there, free of movement for walking. So in conclusions, I'm going to end it here because I know I'm over my time limit now. My final thoughts is women's clothing and fashion is always changing. It's always adapting. It's always being recycled. When you're looking at textiles out of the 18th century, so fabrics themselves are being reused right through into the 1850s and the 1860s. Textile is expensive, whereas the work and the labor itself is the cheap aspect of it. You can always rework a garment. And Pride and Prejudice is a great example of garments being reused and adapted for the use of younger children and younger siblings, aka the ball that takes place. And it's always essentially an ebb and flow of how fashions change. Now, this is a question I'm going to ask to Amanda, and that's you can either have me come back and do a talk looking at men's clothing and join me in my dressing room, or I can come back and talk about military uniforms for future talk. So if you are interested in that, those are possibilities. And on that note, thank you for listening to me ramble on for the last 45 minutes. And if you have any questions, now would be a great time. Thank you.